We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Kirişci, who is currently the al-Assad Senior Fellow and Director, Center on the U.S. and Europe's Turkey Project at Brookings Institution. He will be talking to us today about the Syrian refugee crisis and its impact on Turkey.
The topic is a very difficult one, an issue that has been on the agenda of the media here in the United States, but also on the agenda of many actors around the world. And what I should underline with respect to the displacement crisis is that we're entering the sixth year of the Syrian crisis. The early waves of displacement, and let me mention that just about half of the Syrian population has been internally or externally displaced. 4.8 million according to UNHCR statistics, and we should assume that the real figures are larger than 4.8 million, have become refugees, mostly and overwhelmingly in the neighboring countries. Turkey gets frequently mentioned, but we must not forget that there are also 1.1 million refugees in Lebanon. In Lebanon, 1 out of every 4 persons is a refugee, and Lebanon is a fragile state at best. In Jordan, there are about 630,000 refugees, but the Jordanian authorities regularly and incessantly mention that there are 1.2, 1.3 million Syrian refugees, taking into account those who were already there before the Syrian refugee crisis erupted. On top of it, there's about 6.5, 7 million internally displaced Syrians. Little attention is given to them as the focus is more on refugees, particularly refugees who have tried to make their way to Europe. This displacement crisis initially was driven by the regime's attempts to repress the rebellion against the regime and the demands for reform and transformation. But over the years, the conflict in Syria has become very complicated, involving the emergence of radical extremist groups who have fought partly the regime, but also partly other opposition groups, and have provoked displacement within Syria and beyond it as well. And most recently, as I'm sure you've followed since last fall, the Russian intervention in the Syrian conflict has in turn also provoked additional displacement. Jordan and Lebanon, I'm beginning to ease into the topic of ethics and legality issues. Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, right from the beginning, followed what they called open door policy. They opened their borders and allowed the Syrian refugees to stream into their countries. However, Jordan and Lebanon, by late 2014, were becoming nervous, the governments, about the impact that these refugees were having on politics, economics, but the social aspects of their respective countries, and have effectively closed their borders. On the other hand, the Turkish government has continued to pursue the open door policy since 2011. There has also been frequent references to the notion of creating safe zones within Syria. The first topic, I'm not very sure how to word it, but Western attention is very hierarchical. The Syrian crisis has attracted considerable attention and has sucked a lot of resources that the international community has tried to mobilize to address the broader issue, what we call protracted situations of displacement. And in 2014, the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner, announced that there were almost 60 million people who have been displaced, either internally or as refugees across the border. And again in 2014, the United Nations appealed for about $17 billion to be spent on these roughly 60 million displaced people. We, with my colleague Elizabeth Ferris, and we have been working on this issue of Syrian displacement since roughly the summer of 2013, published a series of reports that are available at the website of Brookings, and we have a book that is about to come out, Consequences of Chaos and the Syrian Displacement Crisis and the Failure to Protect. For that book, we calculated that the international community or the United Nations has appealed, not realized, has appealed roughly $1,125 for each displaced Syrian. Whereas the rest of the displaced persons finding themselves in protracted situation receives $210 in appeal. The realization of those budgets is another issue, and the United Nations has two budgets for Syria, one for refugees in the neighboring countries and one for the internally displaced. And those budgets, with the exception of the very early years, 2011, 2012, has consistently been under-realized, and in 2015, the realization rate is just around 50%. And we have to recognize that the realization of those budgets increased as the European crisis impacted Europe from mid-2015. So to recap, one ethical issue here, I think, is not to forget that there are many more displaced persons around the world. We can mention the Afghans, the Somalians, the Yemenis, mustn't forget also the Ukrainians that have been displaced as a result of the Russian intervention in Crimea, but as well as in eastern parts of Ukraine. One last point in that context is, what is happening is that as the Syrian crisis becomes deepened, many countries are channeling their development assistance budget into that area. So what that means is that there are less resources available for developmental projects around the world because humanitarian issues and humanitarian relief issues are taking over the agenda. The second issue I want to address is the fact that protection of refugees is an international responsibility. I will spare you the details of the international refugee regime, but maybe briefly highlight the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. The host countries have to extend protection to refugees, which these three countries that hold the bulk of the refugees in the region do the best they can given the limited resources. What is expected from the rest of the international community is to give the major hosting countries a hand in what is known as burden sharing. And burden sharing, you could argue, has two legs to it. One leg is resettlement of especially vulnerable refugees, women alone with their children, people who have long-term health issues are considered as the vulnerable ones. There, the international community has fallen well short of what would be expected from them in minimum terms. Just to give you an idea, the European Union opened up 22,000 positions for the resettlement of refugees after having bombarded on numerous accounts by the former head of the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, frequently appealed on the international community. Most recently, last year, the figure he had in mind was 160,000 places, but the international community was only able to offer about 125,000 places. But offering places is one thing, and then filling them up is another. The European Union, out of those 22,000 places, have resettled only 4,500 as of the end of the year last year. The case of the United States, dare I say, is much sadder, and I suspect you're following it from the media as well. Since 2011, that is when the crisis began, only 2,500 Syrians have been resettled in the United States. But from the kinds of statements that are coming from some politicians and officials around the United States, you would think that the United States is actually being invaded by Syrian refugees. This is sad. I'm not going to address the ethical side of it, but I feel it's sad because the United States has had a very long record, a highly regarded and respected record of receiving refugees through resettlement. And each year it has a quota of 70,000 places distributed across the world. And the current US administration, after that unfortunate incident occurred on the coast of Turkey and this young little Syrian refugee lost his life, there was a very positive chemistry in the United States, but also in Europe to help with resettlement. And that's the context in which the US administration took the decision to increase the numbers from 70,000 to 85,000, allowing a much larger number for the resettlement of Syrians for 2016. And for 2017, the numbers would go up to, in fiscal year, 100,000. However, right now, everything is frozen and not much is happening given the political context in the US and upcoming elections. The second leg of burden sharing has to do with the earlier point I made about extending financial support to hosting countries. The United States has contributed close to $5 billion to mostly UN agencies and civil society groups, NGOs, operating in an attempt to assist refugees, but also internally displaced persons. The EU as a whole has contributed figures close to the one as in the case of the United States. However, that has not been enough. As I pointed out, the UN budgets have not been realized. And one manifestation of that has been that last year, towards the summer, the World Food Programme had to cut down its contributions to Syrian refugees, especially in Lebanon and Jordan. Many experts believe that the sudden snowballing of refugees into Europe were a function of this limited burden sharing from a resettlement as well as financial aspects of it. A third point that I'd like to raise is the issue of safe zones. The Turkish government particularly frequently brings up the idea of establishing a safe zone into which Syrian refugees or to become refugees can be brought and can be housed. However, the key element here is protection. And again, experts in the area, particularly human rights group, are concerned that the international community may not provide the tight protection that would be necessary to prevent another Srebrenica from occurring. The issue, of course, there is that you have to use an American expression there, boots on the ground. And not just was the case with the Dutch in Srebrenica, but boots that would actually enforce the safe haven against any intrusions or attacks. Second point about safe havens is that it would require a United Nations Security Council decision, and that's where the problem lies, that in the Security Council there is at least one country that has made it very clear that it would object and veto the decision. Without the agreement of the United Nations Security Council, an attempt to create a safe haven would be a violation of international law. However, I'm not an expert on ethics issues. I'd like to think that I appreciate its importance, but here would be a good case of how international law and ethical issues would conflict with each other. You have, on the one hand, international law insisting that there must be a UN Security Council before such a safe haven can be created, because you would be intervening within the territory of a member state of the United Nations. But on the other hand, the absence of a safe haven is exacerbating the situation, humanitarian situation and human rights situation in Syria. A third and rarely studied aspect of a safe haven is the politics of it. The risk that the safe haven, rather than being a safe haven for refugees, might become an area from which attempts would be made to overthrow the regime in Damascus, and hence becoming a kind of area from where subversive efforts are made, in return exposing the refugees there to the dangers of retaliation, and not to mention the dangers of competition and conflict amongst the opposing groups.
My name is Catherine Boura. I am the permanent representative of Greece to the United Nations. And I come, as you all know, from a country that is very heavily inflicted by a humanitarian refugee crisis in the country. But there is another aspect with this movement of the refugees and the migrants, these of the traffickers and the smugglers of people. We had that in Northern Africa, and we have it now in the East Mediterranean. Do you think that this will be possible to be dealt with? Because this poses a real danger and that can undermine any agreement. And of course, it might pose other challenges in the future for the European Union, for Turkey, and for the whole East Mediterranean. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ambassador. I'm glad you brought up the trafficker-smuggler issue and an ethical aspect of it. The Turkish president back in the fall made a critical remark towards the European Union on how the Europeans were insensitive towards the deaths of Muslim children and women as they attempted to cross the Mediterranean. At the time, the issue was the Mediterranean Sea. He was quite angry about it, and I think he had a point there, even though the way in which it was packaged may be challenged and questioned. Having heard that remark, I personally could not help but think about the situation in the Aegean Sea. It is only recently that the Turkish media has begun to refer how a huge business in billions of dollars have emerged as a result of these smuggling operations, which has also involved the manufacturing and the sale of life jackets that don't work. Right? And one ethical aspect of this is to address this issue. And the Turkish Penal Code thanks to the good old days when the European Union was engaging Turkey constructively, adopted a penal code that makes trafficking and smuggling of human beings a very serious crime in Turkey. I'm happy to say that the Turkish authorities have begun to take this issue seriously, but I cannot help wonder if the issue was taken seriously much earlier on, whether this problem would have reached these proportion and whether this many refugees and children would have perished in the Aegean Sea.
Rescue and relief are exceedingly important, but ultimately it's resettlement and assimilation into society. So my question is, of the millions of refugees that we've been talking about, do you have any figures as to how many of them have been resettled in the neighboring Arab countries? And I would also include perhaps Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other countries.
I think there are two aspects to the question you raised. I'd like to first say a few words about what you called assimilation, but what many people call these days integration or accommodation. I think in the neighboring countries there is a recognition, as I said earlier on, that these refugees are there to stay for a long time. I think it took too long a time for the governments to recognize this reality and begin to adjust to it. And two areas are very critical to that adjustment. One is education, because a good proportion of the Syrian refugees are children. And there's a fear that there is already a lost generation there, and that lost generation can have very important implications in terms of security as well, without going into the details of it. But the international community, NGOs, and now the Turkish government has also recognized that something needs to be done on education. I wish there was time to go into the details of it. It's not an easy exercise. The ones in Turkey would have to learn Turkish. What does that mean in terms of the long run? Does it mean they become Turks? Or does it mean that they acquire fluency in Turkish and Arabic, and when the day comes, they go back to Syria to help with constructions? These are very difficult issues to deal with. Hand in hand with education comes access to livelihood, they call it, basically to the labor market, which the Turkish side has accepted, but we yet to see the implementation of it. And I think part of that sum is going to go into that area. And I personally am hoping that this will also give an opportunity, for example, the Turkish and German side to work together to define some best practices in the incorporation of Syrian refugees into the labor market. The two are very related to each other, because when you don't have access to livelihood, it's children that end up working illegally and getting exploited instead of going to school. There is an ethical issue for you. Worse is that girls at an early age are wedded away as second, third wives to families in return for a dowry. There is also the problem of course, prostitution that comes into the picture there. Livelihood, access to livelihood is hope that will address these issues. But hand in hand comes the issue of what you called assimilation or integration of refugees. And debate is just opening on that. Coming to the Arab countries, I'm well aware that Arab countries have been extensively criticized for not admitting refugees for resettlement. However, one has to recognize that there are already a large number of Syrians that are working in these countries. Here often the term Arab countries is used for Gulf countries, for Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, etc. I think everybody has the right to criticize them on it, but one must also recognize that they have unique political and social circumstances that need to be borne in mind, just as is the case with Lebanon, and there is some difficult justification for Lebanon to close its borders to further refugee flows because of the fragility of the balances between different groupings within Lebanon. And I think these countries that we tend to be very critical of in the Gulf have also generously contributed to humanitarian and relief assistance. The ethical problem there, I suspect, is that these governments have also contributed to different rebel groups that in turn have aggravated the humanitarian assistance. But dare I say that that's a problem that every actor that has been involved in the Syrian conflict faces.
Thank you very much. It's perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.